January 30th, 1945, the Baltic Sea. The water is pitch black. The air temperature is 18 degrees below zero. The ocean here doesn't just feel cold, it feels like liquid nitrogen. If a human body falls into this water, the heart stops in less than 3 minutes. The muscles freeze. You sink like a stone. On this night, in the middle of a snowstorm, something is happening that defies imagination. Thousands of people are floating in the freezing waves. They are not soldiers. They are not sailors. They are mothers holding babies. They are grandfathers. They are refugees. They are screaming for help in the darkness, but the only light comes from the searchlights of the few rescue boats that dare to get close. And in the center of this horror is a giant, the Wilhelm Gustloff, once the pride of Nazi Germany, a luxury cruise liner built to show the world the happiness of the Third Reich. Now, it is a dying beast. It is tilting into the sea, groaning as the steel twists and breaks. We have all heard the story of the Titanic. When the Titanic sank, 1,500 people died. The world mourned for a century. Movies were made, books were written. But on this night in 1945, 9,343 people are dying, 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. Over 5,000 of them are children. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an iceberg. This was a hunt. Somewhere in the darkness, watching through a periscope, was a man, Captain Alexander Marinesko, the commander of a Soviet submarine. He watched the ship die, and he didn't feel pity. He felt victory.
How did this happen? How did nearly 10,000 people end up on a single ship designed for 1,800? And why did the world decide to forget the greatest maritime disaster in human history? To understand the tragedy of that night, we cannot start in the water. We have to start on the land. In a port city gripped by the sheer terror of the approaching Red Army. 24 hours earlier, January 29, 1945, the port of Gotenhafen, Gdynia, Poland. The scene on the docks was apocalyptic. The Third Reich was collapsing. The German army, once the conqueror of Europe, was now broken and retreating. And chasing them was the Soviet Red Army. The Russians weren't just coming to conquer. They were coming for revenge. For 4 years, the Germans had burned Russian villages and starved Russian civilians. Now the tide had turned. Stalin's soldiers were pouring into East Prussia, and they were angry. Reports were spreading like wildfire among the German civilians. The Russians are burning everything. They are executing men. They are taking the women. The fear was primal. It was hysteria. 2 million German civilians left their homes in the middle of winter. They walked through snowstorms. They pulled sleds carrying their grandmothers. They had only one goal: the sea. If they could reach the ports, maybe, just maybe, the German Navy could take them west, away from the Russians, to safety. This was Operation Hannibal, the largest sea evacuation in history. Bigger than Dunkirk. And the centerpiece of this operation was the Wilhelm Gustloff. The ship sat at the dock like a gray mountain. It was painted in camouflage military gray now, stripped of its luxury. It was designed to carry 1,800 passengers and crew. But on this day, the counting stopped. The refugees stormed the docks. 60,000 people were trying to get on board. The German guards tried to maintain order, but it was impossible. Mothers threw their babies over the heads of the crowd, hoping someone on the deck would catch them. People climbed up the anchor chains. The captain of the ship, Friedrich Petersen, watched from the bridge. He was a civilian merchant mariner. He was old, tired, and overwhelmed. He ordered the crew to open up every space. "Fill the cabins," he said. "Fill the hallways. Fill the empty swimming pool." They packed people in like cargo, shoulder to shoulder. The air inside the ship became hot and thick with the smell of sweat, wet wool, and fear. The toilets overflowed. The crying of children was constant. By the afternoon of January 30th, the official manifest listed 6,000 people. But that was a lie. Nobody was counting anymore. Historians now estimate there were over 10,500 people on board. It was a floating city, a city of the desperate. But hidden among the crying babies and the terrified mothers were about 1,000 men who would seal the ship's fate. The 2nd U-Boat Training Division. These were military men, submarine crews. They were being evacuated to Germany to man new submarines. Because they were on board, the Gustloff was technically a military transport.
It was a legitimate target. The refugees didn't know it, but their ticket to freedom was actually a death sentence. Miles away, patrolling the icy waters of the Baltic Sea, a steel shark was waiting. The Soviet submarine S-13. The atmosphere inside the sub was foul. It smelled of diesel, unwashed bodies, and rotting cabbage. The temperature was freezing. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. The commander of this boat was Captain Alexander Marinesko. If you saw him, you wouldn't think he was a hero. He looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot. He smelled of vodka. Marinesko was a brilliant sailor, but he was a terrible soldier. He was a drunk. He was rebellious. Just days before leaving port, he had vanished for 3 days in Finland, partying with a local woman while his crew waited. The Soviet secret police, NKVD, wanted to arrest him. They wanted to send him to a gulag for desertion. But the Soviet Navy was short on captains, so his admiral gave him a choice. "Marinesko," he said, "you go out on this patrol. You sink a big German ship. You prove your worth. Or you come back, and we shoot you." Marinesko was a man with a noose around his neck. He wasn't fighting for Stalin. He wasn't fighting for Russia. He was fighting for his own life. He needed a kill, a big one, and he needed it tonight. He pushed his crew hard. He took risks that other captains wouldn't take. He sailed the S-13 into shallow waters, dangerously close to the German minefields. He was hunting. He sat in the conning tower, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. The sea was rough. Snow was falling. Visibility was near zero. But Marinesko waited. He knew the Germans were evacuating. He knew there were targets out there. He just needed one mistake, one slip-up by the Germans. And on the bridge of the Wilhelm Gustloff, that mistake was about to happen. Back on the Gustloff, the ship had left the harbor. It was steaming into the open Baltic Sea. The weather was getting worse. Wind force 7, snowstorms. The ship was groaning under the weight of 10,000 people. But the biggest danger wasn't the weather. It was the command structure. There wasn't one captain on the bridge. There were 4. Captain Peterson, the civilian master of the ship, cautious, careful. Commander Zahn, a military officer from the U-Boat Division, aggressive. 2 other merchant captains who were passengers but couldn't stop giving advice. It was a disaster. Imagine 4 people trying to steer one car on an icy road. They argued about everything. Commander Zahn, the military man, wanted to go fast. "Zigzag!" he shouted. "We must zigzag to avoid submarines. We must go fast!" Captain Peterson, the civilian, was worried about the ship's engines. "The ship is old," he argued. "We cannot zigzag. We will break the engine. We must go slow." They argued about the route. They argued about the escort. The Gustloff was supposed to have 3 torpedo boats guarding it, but 2 of them had broken down and turned back. The massive liner was now alone, guarded by only one tiny torpedo boat, the Louvre. It was like a whale guarded by a goldfish. And then came the fatal moment. A radio message came in. "Minesweepers are operating in your area. Be careful of collision." It was a generic warning. But Captain Peterson panicked. He was terrified of crashing into a German minesweeper in the dark.
he made a decision that defied all logic of war. He ordered the crew, "Turn on the navigation lights." Commander Zahn screamed at him, "Are you insane? You will make us a target! Turn them off!" But Peterson insisted, "Just for a few minutes, just until we clear the Narrows. We don't want a collision." So, in the middle of the pitch-black, war-torn Baltic Sea, the Wilhelm Gustloff turned on its red and green running lights. For a few brief minutes, it lit up like a floating hotel. It was a beacon, a lighthouse in the dark. And miles away, deep beneath the waves, Alexander Marinesko saw it. On the bridge of the Soviet submarine S-13, Captain Marinesko lowered the periscope. He rubbed his eyes. He looked again. He couldn't believe it. A ship, a massive ship, glowing in the dark like a floating city. He turned to his crew. He didn't smile. The alcohol had worn off. Now there was only the cold calculation of a predator. Target sighted. Speed 12 knots. Course 290. Battle stations. Ooga! Ooga! The submarine came alive. Sailors ran to their posts. The smell of sweat and oil filled the air. They knew this was it. This was the big kill they needed to save their captain from the firing squad. Marinesko was a brilliant tactician. He knew he couldn't just fire from anywhere. The German escort boat, the Löwe, had sonar. If he missed, the Löwe would hunt him down and crush the S-13 with depth charges. So, Marinesko did something unexpected. Most submarine captains attack from the open sea. Marinesko decided to attack from the coast. He steered his submarine into the shallow waters near the shore. It was dangerous. The water was only 40 meters deep. If he got stuck, he was dead. But he knew the German lookouts would be scanning the open ocean. They wouldn't expect an attack from the land side. He positioned the S-13 in the darkness of the shoreline, while the Gustloff was silhouetted against the open sea. He stalked the giant ship for 2 hours, like a wolf following a wounded deer. He waited for the perfect angle. He waited until he was less than 1,000 meters away, point-blank range. In the torpedo room of the S-13, the sailors were loading the tubes. These were massive steel cylinders packed with high explosives. But the Russians had a tradition. They didn't just fire metal. They fired hate. Before loading the torpedoes, the sailors took paintbrushes, and they wrote messages on the warheads. On torpedo number 1, they wrote, "For the motherland." On torpedo number 2, they wrote, "For the Soviet people." On torpedo number 3, they wrote, "For Leningrad." Marinesko was from Leningrad. He had seen what the Nazi siege did to his city. On torpedo number 4, they wrote, "For Stalin." The tubes were loaded. The water pressure equalized. In the conning tower, Marinesko watched the seconds tick by on his stopwatch. 9:15 p.m. The Gustloff was right in front of him. A wall of steel. He shouted the order. "Fire 1! Fire 2! Fire 3!" Whoosh! 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 The submarine shuddered as the heavy weapons left the tubes. 3 streaks of bubbles raced through the icy black water. But then, panic. Torpedo number 4, the one for Stalin, jammed. It was stuck in the tube. The timer was armed. If it exploded inside the tube, the submarine would be vaporized. The crew panicked. They grabbed hammers. They grabbed wrenches. They frantically beat on the launch mechanism, trying to disarm the bomb named after their dictator. It was chaos inside the Hunter. But outside, the first 3 torpedoes were running true, traveling at 40 knots, closing the distance. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. At that exact moment, inside the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was warm. It was crowded, but there was a strange sound echoing through the corridors. The ship's loudspeakers were on, and a voice was screaming. It was January 30th, the anniversary of the Nazi rise to power. Adolf Hitler was giving his last ever radio address from his bunker in Berlin. He was ranting about final victory, about secret weapons. His voice echoed in the packed hallways where mothers were trying to nurse their babies. In the ship's cinema, thousands of refugees were trying to sleep on the floor. In the drained swimming pool, the Women's Naval Auxiliary, young girls aged 17 to 25, were talking about home. They felt safe. They were on a big ship. They were leaving the war behind. They thought the nightmare was over. Then, the music stopped, the radio crackled, and the floor jumped. 9:16 p.m. Torpedo number 1 hit the bow. It struck the crew quarters. For the Motherland torpedo. It obliterated the sleeping quarters of the off-duty officers. The front of the ship was instantly turned into twisted metal and fire. The ship shuddered like it had hit a mountain. Before anyone could scream, torpedo number 2 hit amidships for the Soviet people. This was the most tragic hit. It struck directly under the swimming pool. The empty pool was the sleeping quarter for the Women's Auxiliary. Hundreds of young girls. The blast punched through the hull. Shrapnel, glass from the mosaic tiles, and steel tore through the room. The ceiling collapsed. In 1 second, the swimming pool became a slaughterhouse. Most of the girls died instantly. Those who didn't were crushed by the falling debris. Then, torpedo number 3 hit the engine room. For Leningrad! It destroyed the dynamos. It killed the power. The lights went out. The engine stopped. The music stopped. The pumps stopped. For 1 second, there was absolute silence on the dark ocean. And then, the screaming began. Imagine 10,000 people trapped in a steel box, in pitch darkness, with the ship tilting rapidly to the port side. Panic is too small a word. It was a stampede. People in the lower decks tried to rush the staircases, but the staircases were narrow. Thousands of people pushed against each other. They trampled the weak. They trampled the children. If you fell, you never got up. But for the people in the lowest decks, the fate was even worse. The ship had watertight bulkheads, heavy steel doors designed to stop flooding. The crew did their duty. To save the ship from sinking immediately, they closed the doors. They sealed the lower compartments, with families still inside. Thousands of people banged on the steel doors. "Open up! Let us out! The water is coming!" But the doors stayed closed. They drowned in the dark, trapped in the belly of the ship that was supposed to save them. Up on the promenade deck, it was chaos. The ship was listing so badly that you couldn't walk. You had to crawl. The temperature was -18 degrees Celsius. Ice covered everything. The ropes on the lifeboats were frozen solid. The sailors tried to lower the boats. They couldn't. The davits were jammed with ice. Desperate fathers grabbed axes. They smashed at the frozen ropes. They managed to lower a few boats. But because of the tilt of the ship, the boats swung out and crashed against the hull, spilling people into the freezing sea. Flares were fired into the sky. Red light illuminated the horror. Thousands of people sliding down the icy deck, sliding straight into the black water. A German officer stood on the deck. He held his pistol. He looked at his wife and his 2 children. He knew what awaited them in the water. Freezing. Drowning. He looked at the tilting ship. He made a decision that no father should ever have to make. He hugged them. He shot his family, and then himself. He preferred a bullet to the ice. He wasn't the only one. Gunshots rang out across the deck as officers chose the merciful way out for their loved ones. It was the end of the world, and the ship was groaning. The Wilhelm Gustloff was preparing to take its final dive. 9:50 p.m., less than 1 hour after the first torpedo hit, the Wilhelm Gustloff was dying. The ship was now tilted at a terrifying angle. The massive funnels were parallel to the water. As the ship rolled over, the heavy anti-aircraft guns broke loose. They crashed across the deck, crushing the people who were clinging to the rails. And then, the siren. The ship's emergency siren had jammed on. It wailed like a banshee, a long mechanical scream that drowned out the cries of the dying. The lights flickered one last time, and then they went out. The giant ship slid beneath the black waves. It didn't sink slowly like the Titanic. It plummeted. It took thousands of people trapped inside the hull straight to the bottom of the Baltic Sea. But for those on the surface, the nightmare was just beginning. The sea was a graveyard, thousands of heads bobbing in the freezing water. The temperature was so low that ice chunks were floating next to the survivors. Most of the passengers were wearing life jackets, but there was a tragic design flaw, a flaw that makes this story one of the saddest in human history. The life jackets were designed for soldiers, for men. But thousands of the passengers were children. When a small child wore the oversized cork life jacket, it didn't keep their head up. It flipped them over. Mothers held their babies tight, but the cold was relentless. Hypothermia sets in within minutes. First, your hands stop working. Then, you stop shivering. Then, you feel warm, sleepy, and then you die. Searchlights from the rescue torpedo boat Luva swept across the water. What they saw looked like a field of statues, thousands of frozen bodies, still upright in their life jackets, their faces blue, their eyes open, frozen in a silent scream. The German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper arrived on the scene. It was a massive warship. The crew lowered climbing nets. "Climb!" they shouted. "Climb for your lives!" But the people in the water were too cold to climb. Their hands were frozen claws. They couldn't grip the ropes. They drifted past the ship, looking up at the sailors with pleading eyes. And then, the sonar operator on the Admiral Hipper shouted, "Submarine detection! Torpedoes in the water!" The captain of the Hipper faced a choice that would haunt him forever. Stay and save a few hundred people, or save his ship and the 1,500 refugees he already had on board? He chose his ship. He ordered, "Full speed ahead!" The Admiral Hipper surged forward. Its giant propellers churned the water. It drove right through the field of swimmers, crushing bodies, leaving the survivors behind in the dark. Only a few small boats stayed. They pulled 1,252 people from the water, out of 10,600. 9,343 people died. It was a death toll 6 times higher than the Titanic, and almost all of them were civilians. Back on the submarine S-13, Captain Alexander Marinesko was celebrating. He radioed headquarters, "I have sunk the fascist luxury liner." He expected to be a national hero. He expected the gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union. He thought this victory would wipe away his past sins, his drinking, his insubordination. But karma has a way of finding everyone. When he returned to base, the Soviet High Command looked at his record. They looked at his discipline problems. They looked at the fact that he was a drunk. Stalin didn't like flawed heroes. Instead of a medal, they gave him an insult. They refused to give him the title of hero. They downgraded his victory. Within months, he was dishonorably discharged from the Navy. His life fell apart. He was arrested for theft of socialist property, a minor crime. He was sent to a gulag, labor camp, in Siberia for 3 years. The man who sank the biggest ship in history ended up breaking rocks in the frozen wasteland. He died in 1963, poor, alone, forgotten. Cancer took him at age 50. He never got the glory he killed 5,000 children to achieve. It wasn't until 1990, after the Soviet Union fell, that he was finally given the medal. But by then, it didn't matter. He was just another ghost. So, why doesn't Hollywood make movies about the Gustloff? Why does everyone know about the Titanic, but not this? The answer is uncomfortable. History is written by the victors. In 1945, the Germans were the villains, the Nazis. The world had just seen the pictures of Auschwitz. Nobody wanted to hear about German suffering. Nobody wanted to cry for German children. The Allies buried the story. The Russians buried the story because Marinesko was a disgraced drunk, and the Germans were too ashamed to speak. For decades, the Wilhelm Gustloff was a taboo subject. It lies there today. Coordinates: 55 degrees 4 minutes north, 17 degrees 25 minutes east. It is a designated war grave. Divers are forbidden from entering. It is a silent tomb, a steel coffin for 9,000 souls who were in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong flag. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff is the ultimate tragedy of war. It reminds us that when leaders play games of power, it is the innocent who drown. Hitler started the war. Stalin escalated the war. Marinesko pulled the trigger. But the people who paid the price were families huddled in the dark, waiting for a rescue that never came. It was the night the Baltic Sea turned into ice, and the night humanity froze. This was the deadliest maritime disaster in history, yet few people know about it. Do you think the attack was a war crime? Or was it just a tragic consequence of total war? Let me know your verdict in the comments. And if you want to see the story of the only time Americans and Nazis fought together to save prisoners, click this video on your screen right now. It is an incredible story of hope. Thanks for watching.